What happens when love is shattered by betrayal? Clara's life was perfect until the affair that tore everything apart. Now she must face the consequences of her actions and find a way to rebuild. But can she overcome the pain of her past? The hardest part is saying goodbye. But will it be enough to heal? Watch as Clara fights for redemption in a story full of heartbreak, regret, and the struggle for a second chance. Stay tuned to see how far she's willing to go to rebuild what's been lost. Will forgiveness find its way back? Mark Davis sat in the middle of a lavishly decorated living room in their Beverly Hills home, feeling more isolated than ever. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of polite conversation, but it all felt distant to him. Clara, his wife of 15 years, looked radiant as always, chatting animatedly with friends and colleagues. To the outside world, they were the epitome of a perfect couple, the perfect life. But Mark knew better. They had been to parties like this countless times, always playing their roles. He smiled and nodded as the guests complimented them on their beautiful home, their successful careers. Clara's long blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, her bright smile lighting up every conversation. She was everything he had once adored, and yet tonight, something felt off. It had been months, no, years, since they had truly connected. Mark couldn't ignore the sense of emptiness that lingered every time he glanced at Clara. She was there, physically, but emotionally. He had no idea where she had gone. When they were alone, her eyes were often distant, her mind somewhere far away. Their late-night talks had become an exchange of polite pleasantries. The passionate discussions about their dreams and future were long gone. Mark reached for his drink and watched Clara as she laughed with another man, her eyes sparkling with energy. He wasn't sure who the man was, but the way Clara's body language seemed to soften when he spoke to her made Mark's stomach twist. He couldn't remember the last time she had looked at him like that. The warmth in her expression was reserved for this stranger, not her husband. He knew it wasn't just a fleeting feeling. Clara had been different lately. Late nights at work, unexplained absences, a sudden interest in going out with her friends, and when she came back home, she was always on edge, avoiding his questions. It was all so subtle, so well hidden, that Mark found himself questioning whether he was imagining things. Could it be that he was just too busy with his own career to notice? Was it his fault? But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his career that had distanced them. It was something else. He could see it in her eyes, hear it in her laughter. There was something she wasn't telling him. "I think it's time to head home, love?" Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing next to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She smiled, the same perfect smile that had once made his heart race, but now it only made his chest tighten. "Yeah, let's go," Mark replied, his voice sounding distant even to his own ears. He stood up, but as they made their way to the door, his mind continued to race. The emptiness in their marriage was too much to ignore now. He had tried to make things work. He had tried to be the good husband, the provider, the man she had once loved. But that love, whatever it was, felt long gone. In the car ride home, the silence between them was deafening. The hum of the engine was the only sound as Mark focused on the road ahead. Clara's gaze was turned out the window, her face illuminated by the passing street lights. He glanced over at her, catching a glimpse of her profile. She didn't even seem to notice. Was it all over? Could she have already moved on without him even realizing it? "Clara, is everything okay?" he finally asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. He knew he couldn't keep ignoring it. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she looked away again. "Everything's fine, Mark," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "Just tired, that's all." But Mark wasn't convinced. Something wasn't right. And tonight, in that brief moment, he realized just how much he had been ignoring, just how much he had allowed the perfect image to blind him. The car came to a stop in front of their house, but the moment felt like an eternity. Mark sat there for a moment, staring at the house, wondering how much longer he could pretend everything was fine, how much longer he could live this lie. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was in the small things at first. The way Clara had started coming home later, the missed phone calls, and the occasional message she would quickly swipe away when he entered the room. It all seemed so subtle, like the slow erosion of something that had once felt solid. For weeks, Mark tried to convince himself that it was just work stress. Clara was the head of her marketing department after all. But each night when he came home from his long hours at the office, he felt the space between them growing wider, more suffocating. One night as he sat at the dinner table waiting for Clara to arrive, again late, he stared at his phone, mindlessly scrolling through emails. His thoughts kept drifting back to the moments he'd caught her acting strangely. The way she would leave her phone face down, as if guarding a secret. The way her smile had faded in the past months, like she was pretending to be happy. He pushed those thoughts aside, telling himself that she loved him, that she would never betray him. But in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling refused to go away. Something wasn't right. It was around 10 p.m. when Clara finally walked through the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She looked exhausted, but there was something different about her, something Mark couldn't quite place. Her eyes didn't meet his as she walked past him into the kitchen, and she didn't seem in the mood for conversation. "Long day?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. Clara glanced at him, offering a thin smile. "You could say that." She didn't elaborate. She grabbed a glass of water and disappeared into their bedroom. Mark's mind raced. He followed her down the hallway, stopping at the door of their bedroom. He could hear her moving around inside, but she didn't call out to him. Usually they'd share a few words before heading to bed. But tonight, there was a distance he couldn't ignore. He knocked gently. "Clara?" he called, trying to sound calm. There was a brief pause before she answered, her voice muffled through the door. "I'm just getting ready for bed," she replied quickly. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. He retreated to the living room, sitting on the couch, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. It was late, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at him when she entered, like she was somewhere else entirely. The next day, as Mark prepared for another busy day at work, he noticed Clara's phone sitting on the kitchen counter, abandoned and unlocked. A part of him knew it was wrong to snoop, but another part, the part that was starting to feel a creeping sense of unease, couldn't stop himself. His hand reached for the phone, and with one swift motion, he opened the messages. At first, it was just work-related emails and texts from friends, but then he saw it. A text from a number he didn't recognize, sent late the previous night. "Are you free tonight? I miss you." His heart stopped for a beat. The message wasn't from a coworker. It wasn't from a friend. It was from a man. The text felt like a slap in the face, and in that moment, Mark knew. His instincts had been right all along. He didn't know who this person was, but the realization hit him like a wave. Clara had been hiding something. She had been lying to him for who knows how long. His hands trembled as he put the phone back where he had found it. He felt sick to his stomach, but part of him wasn't surprised. He had suspected it for weeks, and now the proof was right in front of him. Clara came into the kitchen a few minutes later, her face as composed as ever. She didn't seem to notice the quiet storm inside Mark. They exchanged brief pleasantries, but the air between them was thick with the unspoken truth. Mark had to leave for work, but as he grabbed his jacket, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The uncertainty that had plagued him for so long was gone. Now, he knew, and knowing gave him a strange kind of clarity. The drive to the office was long and filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. How could she do this to him? They had built a life together, a family. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he hadn't been present in their marriage for a long time. He had been consumed by his work, his career, leaving her to fend for herself. Had he missed the signs? Had he pushed her away without even realizing it? As Mark sat in his office, staring blankly at the screen, the words from that text echoed in his mind. "I miss you." He couldn't stop hearing them. It was clear now. She wasn't just seeking comfort. She was in love with someone else. And the worst part was, he had missed it all. That night, as Mark lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he finally allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. The betrayal was crushing, But he had no one to blame but himself. He had been so blind, so wrapped up in his own life that he hadn't seen what was happening right in front of him. But this was just the beginning. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. He didn't know how or when, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to make her face the consequences of her actions. The morning after Mark discovered Clara's secret text message, he woke up with a knot in his stomach. He hadn't slept a wink, the shock of the previous night's discovery still fresh in his mind. His thoughts were racing, his heart heavy with questions that had no answers. He had always trusted Clara, trusted her with everything. How had he missed the signs? He stared at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over again, trying to make sense of it. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the text was harmless. Maybe it was just a friendly message. But deep down, Mark knew better. The way she had looked at him last night, the way she had avoided his gaze, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Clara was having an affair. He stood up, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. He didn't want to confront her just yet. He needed more proof. He needed to know for sure. It wasn't enough to simply accuse her. He needed evidence. Cold, hard proof. So he did what he had never done before. He waited for Clara to leave the house in the morning, like she always did, heading out to work. As soon as the front door clicked shut behind her, Mark went to her purse where he had seen her phone resting the night before. His hands were shaking, but he pushed through. He couldn't back down now. He unlocked her phone, something he never would have dreamed of doing just a few days ago. But now, everything was different. The trust he had once placed in her felt like a distant memory. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before opening the Messages app. At first, it was just the usual exchange of work-related texts and a few random messages from friends. But then, he saw it again. A message from Daniel, the man who had been making his wife smile in ways Mark hadn't in years. The same man who had sent the text, "Are you free tonight? I miss you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. His heart raced as he scrolled down, each message more damning than the last. They had been texting for weeks, maybe longer. The conversation was filled with flirtation, inside jokes, and more intimate exchanges that left no room for doubt. Clara had been hiding this from him for a long time. The final straw came when he found a message from last night, sent just before Clara had arrived home. It read, "I'll be waiting for you, love. Can't wait to see you again. I miss your touch." Mark's stomach twisted in knots. He closed the phone, his mind spinning, heart pounding. He had been betrayed. His worst fears confirmed. Clara wasn't just seeing Daniel, she was in love with him. Mark had always known something was wrong, but he never imagined it would be this. This wasn't just an affair, it was a full-blown relationship, a secret that Clara had been keeping from him all along. He felt a wave of anger wash over him. How could she do this? How could she betray him like this? After everything they had built together, the house, the life, the family, it all felt like a lie now. He couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around him. Mark stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the perfect view of the city below. Everything in his life had seemed perfect from the outside. The house, the car, the career. But none of it mattered anymore. He had been living a lie. He had always been there for Clara. He had always been the provider, the protector, the man who worked long hours to ensure they had everything they needed. And this was how she repaid him, by giving her love to another man. His hands balled into fists as he fought to contain the rage bubbling inside him. But beneath the anger, there was something else, something darker, hurt, betrayal. The realization that everything he thought he knew about his marriage was a lie. He needed to confront her. He couldn't let this go, but he couldn't do it yet. Not now. Not until he was ready. The tears that he had been holding back all morning finally fell, but he wiped them away quickly. There was no time for weakness now. He had to be strong. He had to face her. He had to make her see what she had done. He walked back to the kitchen, his mind still reeling, and set Clara's phone back exactly where he had found it. He didn't want her to know he had been through it. He wanted to confront her on his terms when he was ready. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, feeling a sense of finality settle over him. The moment he'd been dreading had arrived. The truth was out. Clara had betrayed him. But there was no going back now. The path ahead was set, and he would make her face the consequences. Mark hadn't slept that night. How could he, knowing what he now knew? His mind raced with images of Clara and Daniel and the messages that he had read. He had to confront her, but he wasn't sure how. How did you look someone in the eye when they had shattered the very foundation of your life? The next morning, Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming to herself as if nothing had changed, as if everything was still normal. She was so calm. Mark could feel the fury rising in him, and yet he remained silent, for now. It was when Clara handed him his coffee and gave him a sweet smile that Mark finally spoke, his voice trembling with the weight of what he was about to say. Clara, he didn't know what else to say at first. His throat tightened as he fought to keep his voice steady. I know. Clara froze, her eyes shifting slightly. The smile didn't falter, but the air between them thickened. She set down the coffee cup and her hands trembled ever so slightly. You know? She asked, her voice neutral. But Mark could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. It made his blood run cold. He nodded slowly, a sickening calm settling over him. I know about you and Daniel. I know what's been going on. Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and then very carefully met his gaze. Mark could see the moment she realized there was no escape. The truth had been exposed and the walls she had built were crumbling before her eyes. How long? Mark's voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like it echoed through the silence of the room. Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. The moment stretched on, painfully slow. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He needed answers. He needed her to tell him the truth, to admit what he already knew. How long, Clara? His voice grew louder now, the anger and the hurt bubbling to the surface. Clara blinked, looking away briefly before looking back at him. It's not what you think, Mark, she said softly, but her voice lacked the conviction that used to be there. It's complicated. Mark let out a bitter laugh. Complicated? Really? His voice shook with emotion. You've been lying to me, Clara. For how long? Months? Years? He didn't know which was worse, the lies or the fact that Clara had thought she could get away with it. And now you're telling me it's complicated. Clara's face tightened, and for the first time, Mark saw a crack in her calm exterior. She took a step back, as though trying to put distance between them. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. But things between us haven't been the same for a long time. You've been so distant, Mark. You've been so focused on your work. I couldn't reach you anymore. The words hit Mark like a slap to the face. It was the same thing she had always said, the same excuse for her actions. And yet, as much as he wanted to hate her for it, he couldn't help but feel a stab of guilt. Had he really been that distant? Had he really let her down so much that she felt the need to seek comfort elsewhere? His chest tightened. Is that it then? You needed someone else? You needed him? Clara looked away, her eyes dropping to the floor. I didn't plan for this to happen, Mark. It just did. Daniel made me feel alive again. He showed me attention, something I wasn't getting from you. I thought maybe I could still love you and him, but I was wrong. The finality in her voice hit him like a punch. She had made her choice, and in doing so, she had torn everything apart. The life they had built together, the family they had created. It all felt meaningless now. The woman he had loved for so long, the woman he had trusted with everything, had fallen for someone else. And now she was standing in front of him, offering him nothing but excuses. Mark's anger boiled over, and before he could stop himself, he snapped, How could you do this to me? After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you, for us? Clara's eyes flashed with something like guilt, but it was quickly masked by a coldness Mark had never seen in her before. She took a step toward him, her voice quiet but firm. I'm sorry, Mark, but this is what it is now. I can't change what's happened. I can't go back and pretend like nothing's changed. Her words felt like a knife to his heart. He could hear the finality in her voice, the coldness that had replaced the warmth that used to define their marriage. She was no longer the woman he had loved. She was a stranger. Mark swallowed hard, the words he wanted to say getting caught in his throat. "You've already made your choice, haven't you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Clara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. She couldn't. She knew the truth, and it was too late to take it back. Mark had seen everything now. He stood there staring at her, feeling the weight of the pain crashing over him. He wanted to scream, to shout at her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned away, his back to her, and walked toward the door. Before he left, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I gave you everything, Clara, and this is how you repay me?" He didn't wait for her response. He couldn't. He stepped out of the house and into the cold morning air, the weight of his world collapsing around him. The life he had built, the family he thought he had, was gone, and Clara was gone too, lost to someone else. Mark's heart shattered as he walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the emptiness behind him. Mark sat in the small office of his apartment, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came to mind. The anger that had once burned through him had faded into something darker, something colder. He didn't want to scream anymore, didn't want to cry. Those emotions had taken their toll. Now he needed something else. He needed control. The confrontation with Clara had left him shattered, but something inside him had also ignited. A quiet resolve, an understanding that he wasn't going to let her betray him without consequences. He wasn't sure what form that revenge would take, but he knew one thing. It would be calculated. It would be precise. Clara had shattered everything he believed in, but the pain had faded into the background. The hurt was still there, gnawing at him. But Mark had begun to see something else now, something clear. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt. And in that hurt, he saw the opportunity to regain what he had lost, to take back control of his own life. He closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, letting out a deep breath. Mark had spent his life building things, structures, relationships, businesses, but he had never truly built himself. In this moment, he realized that he had been too consumed with work, with providing, to pay attention to the cracks that were forming in his marriage. And Clara, she had taken that for granted. She had found comfort in someone else. But now, Mark would find his own comfort, his own strength, and the first step in regaining that control was the plan. The next few days were a blur of emotions and calculations. Mark began to withdraw, pulling away from friends and colleagues, focusing on one thing: revenge. He wasn't going to destroy Clara outright. No, he was too smart for that. His revenge would be slower, more subtle, like a piece of poison slowly coursing through her veins until she realized she had been the one to destroy her own life. It wasn't about the affair anymore. It was about power, about reclaiming everything that had been taken from him. He wasn't going to beg for answers. He wasn't going to plead for reconciliation. He was going to make her feel what he felt, helpless, broken, and alone. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of purpose. He had a mission. He had a goal. And now it was all about execution. Clara had left their home for the evening, probably off to meet Daniel. Mark didn't know exactly where she was, but he didn't care. What mattered was what he was about to do next. He stood up, walking to the kitchen. There, lying on the counter, was the phone that had started it all. Clara's phone. It had been left unattended this time, just a few minutes after she'd left. She hadn't thought to lock it, didn't even consider the possibility that Mark would know what he was about to do. Mark picked it up and opened it without hesitation. His fingers moved swiftly, with an almost surgical precision. He navigated through her messages, her calls, the things she thought were hidden from him. He had already read the texts. He had seen enough to know what had been going on between her and Daniel. But now, he was looking for something else, something that would hurt more than anything. He found it quickly, an email buried deep in the archives sent between Clara and Daniel. It was a thread of intimate exchanges, but this one was different. It was a plan for Clara to leave him. "We'll figure it out, Clara. I'll be waiting for you. All we need is the right moment." The words hit him like a physical blow. A plan. She had planned this. For how long? How much of their marriage had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion, while she was making plans to escape? Mark's heart began to race again, but this time the pain didn't overtake him. No, this time it fueled him. This was exactly what he needed. Clara had underestimated him, thinking he was too weak, too emotionally wrecked to see through her games. But he had been paying attention. He had been watching. Now, he would act. Mark closed the phone, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. Clara thought she had the upper hand, that she could walk away and find happiness with Daniel. But what she didn't know was that Mark was already one step ahead. He had already begun to plan his own escape, not physically, but emotionally. He wasn't going to let Clara have the satisfaction of thinking she could tear him down. He would make her regret everything. He would make her feel small, insignificant, and desperate. The next day, Mark sent an email. He didn't say much, just enough to let Clara know that he was no fool, that he knew everything. He didn't need to confront her, not yet. He didn't need to make a scene. The email was simple. I know about you and Daniel. I know everything. I hope you're happy with your choice, but don't think for 1 second that I will let this go without consequences. He hit send. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment longer, but there was nothing more to say. He had done it. The first step in his plan had been executed. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt something akin to peace. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't sad. He was determined. He knew what he had to do, and he was ready. Clara had made her choice, and now, Mark would make sure she felt every bit of the fallout. Clara came home that evening with a nervous energy surrounding her. Mark had sent the email. She had seen it. She had read it twice. The words he had written, so calm, so cold, sent a chill down her spine. She knew this was no empty threat. He knew about Daniel. He knew everything. Mark wasn't crying. He wasn't shouting. He was simply stating facts, facts that were undeniable. Clara had imagined this moment over and over in her mind. She had thought about how she would face him when the truth came out, but nothing prepared her for the icy calm that Mark had shown. She had been prepared for confrontation, for a fight, for something dramatic. But Mark's response was calculated, methodical. He had put her in a corner without lifting a finger. It was like he had already made peace with it. He wasn't asking for an explanation anymore. He didn't need it. Clara felt herself being slowly suffocated by the silence between them. She stepped into the house, her eyes searching for him. Her breath caught when she saw Mark sitting at the kitchen table, his back to her. His posture was stiff, but there was no sign of rage, no sign of emotion. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his presence as if it was an undeniable force pressing against her. "Mark," she said softly, almost hesitantly, unsure of how to approach him. "We need to talk." Mark turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he had sent the email. His expression was unreadable. He said nothing at first, just watched her with a strange calm that unnerved her. "Do we?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. Clara could hear the underlying tension in his tone, but there was no hint of the anger she had expected. She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark, I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. I didn't want to hurt you." His eyes remained fixed on hers. "You didn't mean for it to happen," he repeated softly. "Is that really how you want to explain this?" Clara winced at his words. They stung, and she felt the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. She had always told herself that it wasn't intentional, that her feelings for Daniel had developed over time, that it wasn't something she had set out to do. But hearing Mark repeat it like that, it felt like a lie. She could hear the coldness in his voice, and she knew he saw through her excuses. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. I don't know what else to say." Mark stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't need you to apologize, Clara. I need you to understand something." Clara's heart skipped a beat as she watched him step closer. His presence felt like it was suffocating her, and yet she couldn't pull away. He wasn't angry, but his words felt like a punch to the gut. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you?" he said, his voice quiet but forceful. You think you can have your affair, confess it, and expect everything to go back to normal. You think I'll just forgive you and we'll move on. But it doesn't work that way, Clara. The way he said her name, the coldness with which it fell from his lips, made her stomach churn. She could feel the walls closing in on her. She hadn't expected Mark to be this composed, this calm. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. She reached for him, desperation creeping into her voice. Mark, please, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want any of this. You have to understand that. But Mark stepped back just out of her reach. You don't get it, Clara, he said, his voice cold and detached. You don't understand what you've done. It's not just about the affair. It's about the lies, the deceit. It's about the fact that I've spent years of my life with someone who was never truly there, someone who pretended. Clara felt her chest tighten. It was as if Mark had peeled back the layers of their marriage and exposed everything that had been festering beneath the surface. The truth was undeniable now, and it felt like it was suffocating her. I didn't mean to, her voice faltered. I thought I could love you both. I thought that maybe there was still something left, but it wasn't enough. Mark's eyes softened for a moment, but only for a second. His expression turned bitter, and he shook his head slowly. No, Clara, there's no excuse for this. You chose him over me, over everything we built, and now you want to walk back in here and ask for forgiveness. Do you think that's how this works? Clara's breath hitched as she tried to speak, but words failed her. She had never felt so small, so vulnerable. She couldn't fight him. She couldn't deny what she had done. She had chosen Daniel, and in doing so, she had destroyed everything that mattered. Mark looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and anger, his voice trembling with emotion as he spoke. I loved you, Clara. I trusted you. And now you've left me with nothing but the ashes of what we once had. The finality in his words was crushing. Clara could feel the weight of his disappointment, and it felt like it was breaking her into pieces. She had thought that her affair would fill the emptiness, but now she saw that it had only created a chasm so deep that she couldn't reach him anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes, but Mark didn't look away. He didn't offer comfort. There was no room for that anymore. He had made his decision. I'm sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry, Clara whispered through her tears, but the words felt empty now. Mark's gaze softened, but only for a fleeting moment. Sorry doesn't fix this, Clara. Sorry doesn't bring back what we lost. And with that, he turned away, leaving Clara standing alone in the silence that followed. The days after the confrontation were agonizing, but also strangely liberating for Mark. He felt the sting of betrayal, but more than that, he felt something growing inside him, a cold, calculating fire that burned away the grief. He wasn't ready to forgive Clara, not yet. He didn't know if he ever would. But what he did know was that he wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to plead for her to stay. No, he had something far more potent in mind. It was time for the ultimate revenge. Mark had always prided himself on being methodical, on being able to plan and execute with precision. This would be no different. He wasn't going to confront Clara directly anymore. He wasn't going to shout or throw accusations. Instead, he would make her feel what he had felt: the isolation, the humiliation, the loss, the feeling of being utterly powerless. He started small, using the knowledge he'd gained from Clara's phone. There were things he knew, things she didn't realize he had uncovered. He knew about the plans she and Daniel had discussed, about how she had thought she could walk away from everything without consequence. He knew that Clara had convinced herself that she could have it all. Mark had been paying attention, and now he would make her see the consequences of her actions. But not just yet, not until he had built it up. A week passed. Clara, still feeling the distance between them, began reaching out to Mark in small, seemingly innocent ways. At first, it was an occasional text asking how his day had been, offering a tentative apology. She was testing the waters, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would soften. But Mark didn't respond, not immediately. He let her wonder. He let the silence settle in like a thick fog. Then he did something she never expected. One afternoon, Clara came home to find the house empty. Her heart raced as she walked through the silent rooms, half expecting to find Mark waiting for her with some kind of confrontation. But nothing, not a sound. He wasn't there. On the kitchen counter, however, was a single envelope. Her name was scrawled across the front in Mark's handwriting. Clara's pulse quickened as she reached for the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. "I'm giving you a choice, Clara. You can keep pretending that nothing happened, that everything is fine, or you can finally be honest with yourself. You've made your choice, and now you'll face the consequences. I know everything. You won't get away with it." The words struck her like a punch to the gut. There was no anger in the letter, no fury, just an overwhelming sense of cold finality. Mark wasn't angry anymore. He was something far more dangerous. He was indifferent. And that was the most painful part. She wasn't worth his rage. She was simply an obstacle in his way. Clara felt a wave of panic rise within her. She hadn't expected Mark to respond like this, to be so composed, so cold. This wasn't the man she had once known. This was someone who had stripped away all emotion and had been replaced with something darker, something much harder to deal with. The weeks dragged on, but the silence between them was suffocating. Mark didn't contact Clara, and she was left to stew in her own guilt. Every time she tried to reach out, there was nothing, no response, no acknowledgement. It felt like she was chasing a ghost, a version of Mark that no longer existed. Then came the phone call. It was late at night when Clara's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up, expecting it to be a text or an email from Daniel, but instead the number was unfamiliar. Hesitant, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. The voice on the other end was calm, distant. "Clara, it's me. I think it's time we have a conversation." Her heart dropped into her stomach. It was Mark. His voice was so detached, so neutral. It was like talking to a stranger. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Where are you?" Mark asked, his voice cold. "Come meet me. We need to talk, now." Clara's mind raced. She had no idea what this was about, but the urgency in Mark's tone sent a jolt of fear through her. She hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by a mix of guilt and fear, she agreed. She had no choice. When Clara arrived at the meeting place, a small cafe on the edge of town, Mark was already there, sitting at a table by the window. He looked the same, yet somehow different. His demeanor was calm, collected. He wasn't angry, but there was something unsettling about him. She sat down opposite him, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. "You've made your choice, Clara," Mark said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You chose Daniel over me, over everything we had, and now you'll see what happens when you betray me." Clara swallowed hard. "Mark, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know it would come to this." Mark's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't think. You just acted, and now you'll face the consequences. I'm not going to make this easy for you." Clara's throat tightened. "What do you mean? What are you going to do?" Mark leaned forward, his gaze unblinking. "I'm going to make you feel what I felt. Alone, betrayed, powerless. You won't be able to escape it." Clara recoiled slightly, but Mark didn't give her a chance to respond. He stood up, his expression unwavering. "I don't want to see you again, Clara. Not until you understand what you've done." And with that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Clara staring after him, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, suffocating her. She had no idea what he was planning, but she knew one thing for sure. Mark wasn't going to forgive her, not now, not ever. Clara sat alone in the silence of their home, feeling the weight of the emptiness that filled every corner of the room. It had been hours since Mark had walked out of the cafe, and still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the very foundation of her life. He had said it so simply, so coldly. "I'm going to make you feel what I felt." But what did that mean? What kind of revenge was he planning? The thought made her stomach churn. She stood up from the couch, pacing back and forth, her hands trembling as they ran through her hair. The guilt that had been gnawing at her since the confrontation now felt like a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It wasn't just about the lies or the betrayal. It was about the fact that she had lost Mark in the process. She had lost everything that had once mattered to her. Clara's mind raced as she replayed the conversation with Mark. His calm, detached demeanor, the way he had spoken to her as if she were a stranger. She had expected anger, desperation, maybe even tears. But what she had gotten instead was a cold, calculated man who had no intention of forgiving her. He wasn't going to plead for her love or beg her to come back. No, he was going to make her regret everything. He was going to make her feel as powerless and alone as she had made him feel. The thought of Daniel crossed her mind, but it was fleeting. Daniel had been her escape, her temporary solace in a world that felt increasingly unmanageable. But now, in the darkness of their home, she realized that he wasn't the answer either. He had been a distraction, nothing more. She had used him to fill a void, but the emptiness inside her remained. The love she had once felt for Mark, the trust, the shared history, it was all slipping away and there was no going back. She sank down onto the couch, her body shaking as she wrapped her arms around herself. The tears came then, hot and relentless. She had never felt so utterly alone in her life. There was no one left to turn to, no one to help her make sense of the mess she had created. It was just her, alone with her regret, her guilt, and the haunting realization that she had destroyed the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Mark had been right about everything. He had seen through her lies. He had known what she was doing even when she had convinced herself that she was hiding it all so well. He had given her everything, his love, his trust, his loyalty, and she had thrown it all away for a fleeting moment of excitement, for a relationship that was nothing but a fantasy. Now she was left with nothing. The silence in the house felt oppressive, like it was closing in on her. Every corner, every piece of furniture seemed to mock her, reminding her of the life she had thrown away. She thought about the life they had built together, the memories they had created, and it felt like a distant dream. She had betrayed him, betrayed herself, and now she was facing the consequences. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, her head resting on them as the sobs racked through her body. The weight of it all was too much. She had no one to blame but herself, and as much as she wanted to run to Daniel, to find solace in his arms, she knew it wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring back what she had lost. Hours passed, though Clara wasn't sure how many. She sat there in the darkness, lost in her thoughts, her mind swirling with guilt and shame. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the person she had become. The woman she had betrayed her husband for wasn't the same person she had been when they had first met. She had changed, and not in the way she had hoped. She had become someone unrecognizable, someone who had abandoned everything for fleeting moments of pleasure. Clara didn't know how much time had passed before the sound of a knock at the door broke through the silence. Her heart jumped in her chest, her breath catching as she quickly wiped away her tears. She didn't want to face anyone, especially not Mark. But then she remembered the voicemail. It was the voicemail from earlier, from Daniel. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, her hands shaking with fear and anticipation. She had been avoiding him for days, unable to face him after the confrontation with Mark. But she knew she couldn't keep running. She had to face the music. She had to answer. She pressed play. Clara, I've been thinking. Maybe it's better if we take a step back. I'm not sure if this is really what we want. You deserve more than just a distraction. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. The words hit her like a slap in the face. The man she had turned to for comfort, someone she had convinced herself she was in love with, was now pulling away. He didn't want to be with her. He didn't want to be the reason she lost everything. Clara sank back into the couch, her heart sinking. How had she gotten here? How had she become the woman who had everything and yet lost it all? Daniel was right. She had lost everything. She had lost Mark, and now she was losing herself. She stared at her phone, the voice message still playing in the background. There was no more escape, no more distractions. It was just her now, facing the consequences of her actions. And for the first time, Clara realized that the pain she was feeling was only the beginning. Clara stood at the window, staring out at the dimming city skyline, her thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and regret. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and for a moment she hesitated. She had been avoiding it for days, avoiding him, Daniel. But she knew deep down she couldn't keep running from the inevitable. Taking a deep breath, she opened the message. Clara, I know things have been difficult, but I can't stop thinking about you. We need to talk. His words seemed innocent enough, but Clara knew the weight they carried. The last time they had spoken, he had distanced himself. He had made it clear that their relationship was nothing more than a distraction for both of them, something temporary. And yet, now, he was back, wanting to talk. The room felt suddenly small. Clara's heart pounded as she stared at the screen, fighting the urge to call him, to tell him to stay away, but the words wouldn't come. She had never been able to resist him, and now, as the darkness of the evening crept in, she was unsure if she could ever truly let go. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. Clara. Daniel's voice came through the receiver, soft, hesitant. I miss you. The words hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding on to that fleeting connection until that very moment. She closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of guilt and longing. Was she really so weak, so desperate for affection, for someone to fill the emptiness Mark had left behind? Daniel, I don't know what to say, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Everything's fallen apart. I don't even know who I am anymore. He was quiet for a moment, and then she heard him sigh. I get it, Clara, but I can't stop thinking about what we had, what we could have. You deserve more than this mess. You deserve to be happy. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. Happiness. It felt so far out of reach, something she could barely even dream of after everything she had done. The betrayal, the lies, the way she had hurt Mark without a second thought. Now Daniel was offering her a way out of it, a way to escape from the consequences. But could she take it? Daniel, she began, her voice faltering. I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this. But I've hurt so many people, I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it. Daniel's voice softened, but there was an urgency in it. Clara, I'm here for you. You don't have to face this alone. We can start over. We can leave this all behind and be together. The idea of running away with him, of leaving the pain and guilt behind, seemed so tempting. She could leave it all behind, Mark, the mess she had made, and start fresh, with someone who made her feel wanted. But Clara knew that deep down it wouldn't work. Daniel wasn't the answer. He never had been. I don't know, Daniel, she whispered, her mind racing. I don't know if I can just erase what I've done. I've hurt him. I've hurt myself. I'm not sure I deserve to be happy. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said something that made her heart clench. You deserve more than this, Clara. More than the man who doesn't see you for who you really are. More than the lies. Her stomach dropped. Was that what Daniel really thought? Was that what she had become in his eyes? Someone desperate for validation. Someone willing to escape the consequences of her actions. She had thought he was her salvation, her escape. But now it seemed clear that he was just as lost as she was. I've made so many mistakes, Daniel, she said softly. But I need to fix them, not run away from them. She could hear him exhale sharply on the other end of the line, his frustration palpable. Clara, you can't keep punishing yourself. You can't keep pretending nothing happened. You can't go back. You just have to decide what you want moving forward. Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She had been so selfish, so consumed by her own needs and desires that she hadn't stopped to think about the destruction she was leaving in her wake. Mark, the man who had loved her unconditionally, the man she had once promised to build a life with, she had betrayed him. And now, she had to face the consequences. I've made my choice, Daniel, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But it's not you. I can't keep running. I have to face what I've done. There was silence on the other end of the line. Clara's heart thudded in her chest as she waited for him to respond, afraid of what he might say. After a long moment, Daniel spoke, his voice tinged with sadness. I understand, Clara. But I hope you know I'll always be here if you need me." Clara didn't know what to say. She couldn't tell if his words were an offer of comfort or just another way to keep her trapped in the confusion she had created. But it didn't matter. She couldn't keep running from the truth. The truth was, she had to face what she had done, and she couldn't rely on anyone else to make it better. "I'll be okay," Clara said, her voice cracking. "I just need to figure things out. I need time." The call ended, and Clara sat there in the silence, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. Daniel was gone, just like everyone else. The momentary comfort he had offered now felt hollow. She had nothing left. The house was empty. The life she had once known was gone. The consequences of her actions were slowly closing in on her, and she was left with nothing but the darkness. Clara stared at the empty glass in front of her, the ice cubes slowly melting in the whiskey she had poured herself hours ago. The warmth in her chest was not the kind she had once felt when she was with Mark. This was something different. It was numbness, an attempt to dull the sharp edge of the pain that had consumed her every waking moment since the affair had come to light. Her phone sat beside her, silent, as if it too was waiting for something, waiting for an apology that had never come, for a text message she would never send. It had been days since she had last spoken to Mark, and each day that passed felt heavier than the last. His coldness, his indifference, it was like a void had opened up between them, a gulf so wide she wasn't sure if it could ever be crossed again. But the truth was, Clara wasn't sure she wanted to cross it. The phone rang. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was a number she didn't recognize. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but something made her answer. "Hello?" Her voice was shaky, but she didn't care. There was a brief pause on the other end before a familiar voice spoke, cutting through the fog of her thoughts. "Clara, it's me, Mark." Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to face him, not after everything. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight, the bitterness she felt bleeding through. "I want to talk," he said, his voice so calm, so controlled, that it almost felt like a slap. "I think it's time." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her. She wasn't ready to talk to him. She wasn't ready to face the man she had betrayed, the man who had given her everything and had been left with nothing. Yet, as much as she tried to ignore it, the gravity of his words pulled her in. "About what?" she asked, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The truth, the whole truth," Mark replied, his voice unshakable. "I want you to hear me out." Clara's grip on the phone tightened. Her mind screamed for her to say no, to hang up, to leave him in the past where he belonged. But something inside her, something fragile and aching, told her that this conversation, painful as it might be, was something she had to have. "I'll meet you," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "But I can't promise anything." "I don't expect you to," Mark replied, and there was no softness in his words. No forgiveness. "I just need you to hear me." Clara didn't know what she expected when she agreed to meet him. She didn't know if she wanted closure, if she wanted forgiveness, or if she just wanted to hear him say the things she knew he had been holding back. She only knew that she couldn't keep pretending that nothing had happened. She couldn't keep running from the man who had once been her everything. The cafe where they met was almost deserted, just the quiet hum of a coffee machine and the soft clinking of a spoon against a cup. Clara's heart raced as she sat down at the table, her palms clammy. She had no idea what was going to happen, but she knew this moment, this conversation, was going to define everything that came after. When Mark arrived, he didn't greet her. He didn't try to be polite. He simply sat down across from her, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "You know why I'm here," he said flatly, his voice low and controlled. "You know what you've done." Clara nodded slowly, her throat tight. "I do." Mark leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I've been thinking about this, about everything that's happened, the lies, the betrayal, the way you thought you could just leave me for him, for Daniel." The words stung, but they were true. She had thought she could walk away from her marriage, from the man who had been there for her through everything. She had let her selfishness take over, And now here she was, facing the consequences. I never wanted to hurt you, Clara said, her voice breaking. I never wanted any of this. Mark's eyes narrowed. But you did, Clara. You did hurt me. You destroyed everything we built. And I let you. I let you because I thought we could work through it. But I was wrong. Clara swallowed hard, the words getting stuck in her throat. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix myself. Mark's lips curled into a bitter smile. You didn't need to fix anything. You needed to face the truth. You needed to be honest with me. And with yourself. I wasn't, she whispered, the weight of his words crashing over her. I didn't know how. Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You don't know how much I wanted to believe in you, Clara. I wanted to believe that we could fix this. But now all I see is a stranger sitting in front of me, someone I don't even recognize. Clara closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mark. I don't know what else to say. But Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, his fingers tapping the table lightly, as if he were considering something important. Here's the thing, Clara, he said finally, his voice low. I don't need your apology. I don't need you to tell me how sorry you are. What I need, what I want, is for you to understand how deep the damage is. How much you've changed everything. Clara looked up at him, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had expected anger, bitterness, maybe even hatred. But what she saw in his eyes now was something far more terrifying. It was indifference. The love was gone. The trust was gone. And what was left was a void, a cold, empty space where once there had been a life. I can't fix this, Mark, she said, her voice barely audible. I can't fix what I've broken. He didn't look at her. He just shook his head. No, you can't. The finality in his words broke something deep inside Clara. For the first time since all of this started, she realized that she had lost him, that he was gone, not just from her, but from her life, her future. Mark stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't say another word. He simply walked away, leaving Clara alone in the cold silence of the cafe. The truth had finally set in. Clara couldn't sleep. The events of the past weeks had worn her down, leaving her in a state of constant unease. Mark had stopped responding to her calls and texts. Daniel, too, had vanished, leaving her feeling more alone than ever. She had lost control of everything. The life she had once taken for granted was slipping through her fingers, and all she could do was watch. The guilt, the pain, the regret, it all weighed on her chest, suffocating her, and she had no idea how to fix it. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't let it end like this. Not without facing Mark. Not without hearing him say everything he had been holding back. Every hurtful word that he had kept to himself. The thought terrified her, but it also called to her, like a beacon in the distance. She had to do this. She had to face him. Clara picked up the phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing Mark's number. Her finger hovered over the call button, but her heart was pounding too loudly to hear anything else. What would she say? What could she say? She pressed call. It rang once, twice, and then Mark's voice filled her ear, cool and distant. Clara. The way he said her name sent a chill through her body. She hadn't heard it sound so detached, so devoid of emotion. It was like he was already miles away, even though he was right there on the other end of the line. I need to talk to you, Clara said, her voice unsteady. Please, just give me a chance to explain. There was a long pause on the other end. She could almost hear him weighing his options, deciding whether or not he should even engage with her. I don't think there's much to explain, Mark finally replied, his voice calm but firm. You made your choice. You made it clear enough. The words stung, but Clara wasn't about to back down. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Mark, I know I've hurt you. I've been stupid. I've been selfish, but please just hear me out. I never wanted to hurt you, but I made mistakes. Big ones. Mark was silent. Clara could feel him on the other end, but it wasn't a presence that made her feel safe. It felt like he was waiting for something, a reason, a justification for what she had done. But she didn't have any excuses. She couldn't lie to him anymore. I don't expect you to forgive me, Clara continued, her voice cracking with emotion. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I was just so lost. I didn't know how to fix myself, how to fix us, and I'm sorry for everything." There was another long silence, and Clara's heart sank. She was waiting for him to say something, anything, but he remained quiet. "Why didn't you come to me?" Mark's voice broke through, soft but laced with hurt. "Why didn't you come to me before it all went this far?" Clara's breath hitched. The pain in his voice was palpable, and it tore through her. How could she have been so blind, so wrapped up in her own turmoil that she didn't see how much she was hurting him? "I was scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Scared of losing you, scared of the truth. I thought I could fix it on my own, that I didn't need to admit how broken I was." "And now?" Mark asked, his voice cold. "Now you want to fix it? Now you want to pretend everything can just go back to normal?" Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. "No, Mark, I don't think it can go back to normal. I don't expect you to just forgive me and pretend everything's fine, but I need to make it right. Even if I can't undo what I've done, I have to face it. I can't live with myself if I don't." She heard him sigh heavily on the other end, the sound of frustration mixed with resignation. "Clara, I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can forget what you did. I gave you everything and you threw it all away." "I know," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry. I can't take back what I did, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, like the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them. Clara felt the walls closing in on her, the darkness creeping in. But she knew this was the moment she had to face. Finally, Mark spoke again, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "I don't know if I can do this, Clara," he said, each word heavy with finality. "I don't know if I can forgive you, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to fix what's broken." Clara's heart shattered in her chest. She had known it was coming, but hearing him say it aloud made it feel real in a way nothing else had. The life they had built together was gone. The trust, the love, it was all gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. "I understand," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to. I needed you to hear me." There was another long silence, and this time, Mark's voice was almost gentle when he spoke. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said quietly, and there was nothing left but the cold sting of finality. "I wish it could have been different, but it's too late." Clara closed her eyes, the tears flowing freely now. There was no more running from the truth. There was no more hope. It was over. "I know," she whispered, her heart breaking with the weight of it all. And with that, Mark hung up. Clara stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. It had been weeks since the final conversation with Mark. Weeks since the last time she had seen him, the man who had once been her world. The house felt emptier now, the silence louder. There was no more echo of laughter, no more shared glances or gentle touches. It was just her, alone. She had spent the past few days trying to make sense of everything that had happened, trying to understand where it all went wrong, trying to rebuild the parts of her that had shattered with the end of her marriage, with the destruction of everything she had known and loved. The pain was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. But now it was different. Now it was more of a dull ache, a reminder that she had made choices, that she had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. And now she had to face the aftermath of those choices. She had to face the consequences. But Clara had made a decision. She couldn't keep living in the past, buried under the weight of her mistakes. She had to move on. It wasn't going to be easy, not by a long shot. But she had come to realize that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending that everything was fine. Moving on meant accepting what had happened, forgiving herself for the mistakes she had made, and finding a way to start over. The hardest part was facing the emptiness that came with being alone. For so long she had relied on Mark, on their shared life, to define who she was. But now, that anchor was gone. Now it was just Clara. And for the first time, she realized she didn't know who she was without him. She reached for her phone, staring at it for a long moment. It had been some time since she last spoke to Daniel. She had thought he was the answer, the way out. But now, with everything that had happened, she knew he wasn't. He had been another distraction, another escape from facing the truth. She needed to stop running. She needed to stop looking for external validation. She needed to rebuild herself, not rely on someone else to fix her. Taking a deep breath, Clara deleted his number from her phone. It was a small action, but one that felt significant. She didn't need him. Not anymore. Clara had spent so much time pretending to be someone she wasn't, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect woman. But now, as she stood alone in the quiet of her house, she realized that she didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be herself. She needed to find out who that was. The first step, she realized, was learning to be alone. It wasn't something she had ever been comfortable with. She had always filled the silence with distractions, with people, with things to do. But now the silence was overwhelming. Still, Clara knew it was the only way she could heal. She had to be comfortable with herself before she could move forward. So, she started small. She began going for long walks around the neighborhood, enjoying the solitude. She took up journaling again, something she hadn't done in years. It felt good to put her thoughts on paper, to get everything out of her head and onto the page. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks, she began to feel something new growing inside her. A sense of peace. Not the kind of peace that came from avoiding conflict, but the kind that came from accepting her flaws, her mistakes, and realizing that she was capable of moving forward despite them. She reached out to friends she had neglected during the turmoil of her affair and its aftermath. She reconnected with old hobbies, the things that had made her feel whole before everything had fallen apart. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she was living for herself, not for anyone else, not for Mark, not for Daniel, not for anyone but her. But the pain of what she had lost still lingered. Every time she thought about Mark, about the life they could have had, the guilt and regret rushed back in, threatening to undo all the progress she had made. It was then that Clara realized that the key to moving on wasn't in forgetting. It wasn't in erasing the past. It was in accepting it, in learning to live with it, and in understanding that sometimes life simply didn't go the way we wanted. She couldn't fix her past. She couldn't undo her mistakes, but she could control her future. And that was the most empowering realization of all. Clara began to take her first steps into a new life. She started therapy, something she had been avoiding for months. She knew it was time to address the deeper issues that had led her down this path. She didn't expect it to be easy, but she knew it was necessary, and slowly she began to heal. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges. There would be days when the guilt would return, when the memories would flood her mind, and when she would feel like giving up. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't going to let the mistakes of her past define her future. She wasn't going to let the regret of her actions dictate the rest of her life. She was going to rebuild from the ground up. And no matter how long it took, she was going to find herself again. Clara stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman who stared back at her. Her reflection was different now, softer, more genuine, but still scarred. The weight of her past lingered, but it was no longer a chain around her neck. It was just a part of who she was, a reminder of where she had been and how far she had come. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt something close to peace. She had been working hard, working on herself, working to rebuild the relationships she had destroyed. The last few months had been about learning to face the truth, accepting her mistakes, and learning to forgive herself. It hadn't been easy. There were days when she felt like she wasn't making progress, like she was stuck in the same cycle of regret. But with each step forward, with each small victory, she found herself becoming someone new, someone who wasn't defined by her mistakes, but by her ability to rise above them. She had started therapy. At first, it had been uncomfortable trying to dig into the wounds she had ignored for so long. But the more she faced them, the more she realized that she had been running away from herself, from the truth of who she was, who she had become, and who she still had the potential to be. Clara had also reached out to Mark. She knew it was unlikely that they would reconcile, but she couldn't go on carrying the burden of their unfinished business. The apology she had given before had been heartfelt, but it had been the start of her healing, not the end. She had to give him the space he needed to heal too, but she couldn't move on without letting him know that she was truly sorry, that she was trying to become a better person, not just for herself, but for the world she had nearly destroyed. The message she had left for Mark was simple. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry for that. I'm not asking for anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you know that I'm truly sorry for everything. She had no idea what Mark's response would be. She didn't even expect one. But just knowing she had said it, the words that had been trapped inside her for so long, gave her a sense of closure, a sense of redemption. As she left the therapy session that day, Clara felt lighter than she had in months. The process wasn't quick, healing never was. But each step forward felt like a triumph. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't whole yet, but she was getting there. She thought about Daniel, about the way he had been her escape, her temporary fix, the man she had turned to when she had felt lost, when Mark's love had felt too heavy to carry. But Clara knew now that Daniel had never been the answer. He had been a distraction, a brief moment of comfort that had only added to her confusion. She had used him, and she had used herself in the process. But now she was learning to be honest with herself, to accept that the love she had with Mark, though it was broken, had been real. It had been something worth holding on to. She didn't know what the future would look like, but she knew that she had to move forward with clarity, not with the weight of her past holding her back. That evening, Clara found herself at the same cafe where she and Mark had last spoken. It wasn't planned. She had just ended up there, drawn by the memories that lingered in the corners of her mind. She sat down at the same table they had shared so many months ago, feeling the stillness around her. But now it felt different. Now she felt like she could breathe. The pain that had once been overwhelming was now manageable. It was still there, but it no longer controlled her. As she sat there, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mark. I'm still processing everything, Clara, but I hope you find the peace you're looking for. Clara stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't a response she had expected, nor the response she had hoped for, but it was something. It was enough to know that Mark wasn't completely shutting her out. He was still processing, still trying to make sense of it all, and that was all she could ask for. She wiped the tear that had slipped down her cheek and smiled faintly. She had never asked for things to go back to how they were. She knew that was impossible. But this was a start to understanding, to forgiveness, and to healing. Clara's phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Mark. It was a notification about her volunteer work, a reminder that her time at the shelter was coming up. Clara had started volunteering after months of therapy, wanting to do something that gave her purpose. She wanted to help others find the strength she had struggled so hard to find in herself. It was a small step, but it felt like a big one. She was giving back to the world, showing herself that she was capable of making a positive impact. For the first time in months, Clara felt a sense of hope. She didn't know what her future would look like, and she didn't know if she would ever fully heal from the mistakes she had made. But she knew she was on the right path. She was rebuilding, piece by piece, and that was all she could ask for. Clara stood up, taking one last look at the empty cafe, the place where so much had happened, and walked out into the night. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't fixed, but she was learning. She was moving forward, and that was enough. Clara stood in front of the door, her fingers hovering over the handle, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready to say goodbye for good. Mark hadn't reached out since their last conversation. The silence between them had stretched for weeks, thick and suffocating. But now, as Clara prepared to leave their shared home, her home, their home, It felt like the end of something far bigger than just their relationship. It felt like the end of a chapter in her life, a chapter she would never be able to rewrite. Her hand trembled as she slowly turned the door handle and stepped out into the cool evening air. The house, once filled with laughter and promises, now felt like a hollow shell. Every room, every corner held memories, memories of moments she had taken for granted, the love, the connection, the life they had built together. It was all slipping away, and Clara could no longer pretend that it didn't hurt. As she stepped into her car, she found herself looking back one last time, taking in the sight of the house. Mark's house, no longer hers. Her mind raced with questions. What had gone wrong? What had she missed? Was there still a chance to fix this? But deep down, Clara knew that the answer wasn't simple. The damage was done. There were no easy fixes, no quick solutions. She'd made choices, and those choices had consequences. And now it was time for her to accept those consequences and move forward. The drive to the park was short, but every minute felt like an eternity. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel, her mind flashing through everything she had gone through, the affair, the betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak. And in the quiet, she could hear Mark's voice, clear and steady, telling her the things she didn't want to hear. I don't know if I can forgive you. It's too late, Clara. She had heard those words, and yet she hadn't truly listened. Maybe because part of her had hoped that they could fix it, that they could find their way back to each other. But now, she understood. It wasn't that simple. Trust, once broken, couldn't be mended in a moment. The park was empty when Clara arrived. It was late, the streets quiet, the soft hum of the city barely noticeable in the background. She pulled into a parking space, the headlights casting long shadows over the trees. It was here that she had decided to meet Mark one last time, to say goodbye. She didn't know why it had to be here, but maybe it was because the park had always been their place. The place they had first met, the place where they had shared so many moments, both happy and painful. This was where they had once been whole, and Clara wanted to close that chapter here, where it had all begun. Clara sat on the edge of a bench, her eyes scanning the dark, waiting for him. She had asked him to meet her one last time. She didn't expect him to show up, but she needed to see him, to hear him, to know that this was truly the end. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. I'm here. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked up and saw him walking toward her, his figure cutting through the night. He had aged in the weeks since their last conversation. The anger, the hurt, it was all there in his eyes. But there was something else too. Weariness. The quiet resignation of someone who had given all they could, only to have it thrown back in their face. Mark stopped a few feet away from her, his hands in his pockets. He didn't sit down. He didn't approach her. He just stood there, staring at her, as if waiting for her to speak. Clara's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. I didn't know how to fix this, Mark. I still don't. Mark's eyes softened, but only for a moment. The silence between them stretched, neither of them sure of what to say next. I tried to fix it, Clara, Mark said quietly, his voice rough. I really did. But we can't fix something that's already been broken this badly. Clara's heart ached at the truth of his words. She knew it. She had known it all along. But hearing him say it out loud made it real. Too real. I was selfish, Clara whispered, her voice shaking. I was so consumed by my own fears, my own doubts, and I hurt you. I hurt us. Mark nodded slowly, the hurt evident in his eyes. You did, Clara. You hurt me, you hurt us. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that. I don't know if I can ever forget it. Clara's chest tightened. This was it. This was the final goodbye. She had spent so long running from the truth, from the consequences of her actions, but now, standing before him, she could no longer hide from it. She had broken something that could never be repaired. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'll carry this with me for the rest of my life. Mark was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his words heavy with finality. I know you're sorry, but sometimes, Clara, being sorry isn't enough. Clara felt the tears fall, but she didn't try to stop them. This was the moment she had been avoiding, the moment she had known was coming but hadn't wanted to face. Goodbye, Mark, she said quietly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Mark didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Clara stayed there, staring at the spot where he had been standing, her heart breaking all over again. But she knew this was the end. She knew that she couldn't go back, that nothing would ever be the same again. The chapter was closed, the book finished, and with that, Clara was left alone in the night. But this time it was different. This time, she was finally ready to move forward. Clara woke up the next morning with a heaviness in her chest. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the chaos that had unraveled within her. Yet everything felt different. The weight of Mark's final words, his quiet departure, lingered in her mind, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly alone. The house felt eerily quiet as she moved through the rooms, each step echoing in the silence. She had spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to mend what had been broken. But now she understood. Some things were beyond repair. Some things had been shattered beyond recognition, and no amount of effort could bring them back to the way they were. The morning routine felt almost robotic. She made coffee, stared out the window, and then returned to her thoughts. The space she had once shared with Mark was now just an empty shell, filled with memories of a time that felt like another lifetime. Their love, their connection. It had all seemed so real, so certain. Now, it was just a series of moments, fleeting and fragile, lost to time. Clara sat down on the couch, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, the bitterness of the drink matching the taste in her mouth. She had known it would come to this, the final goodbye, but she hadn't realized how much it would break her. She had imagined this moment in her mind over and over, but nothing had prepared her for the emptiness that followed. It wasn't just the loss of Mark, it was the loss of herself. The woman she had been before all of this seemed like a distant memory, someone she couldn't quite recognize. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, half expecting another message from Mark, some final word, some hint of resolution. But it wasn't him. It was a text from her therapist, reminding her of an upcoming session. Clara stared at the message for a moment, her mind swimming. She had been so focused on her relationship with Mark, so consumed by the aftermath of her actions, that she had almost forgotten the most important thing, the work she had to do on herself, the healing. Clara's fingers hovered over the screen, but she hesitated. Was she ready to face herself fully? Was she ready to confront the deep-rooted issues that had led her to make those choices in the first place? The affair, the betrayal, the lies, the escape. She took a deep breath, pressing the button to confirm the appointment. She wasn't sure she could ever truly undo the damage she had caused, but she knew she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep running from the truth. It was time to face the consequences, no matter how painful they were. The next few days were a blur. Clara threw herself into her work, into her therapy sessions, into anything that might distract her from the gaping hole left by the end of her marriage. But no matter how hard she tried, the quiet emptiness followed her everywhere. There was no escaping the weight of what she had done, of the choices she had made, and the consequences that came with them. One night, as Clara sat in her living room staring at the flickering light of the television without really watching, a message from Daniel appeared on her phone. It was short, simple. Clara, I know things ended badly, but I've been thinking about you. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Her heart tightened. She hadn't expected to hear from him. After everything that had happened, she had pushed him out of her life, knowing that he was another distraction, another way to avoid facing the truth. But now, reading his message, she felt a familiar pull, a desire to reach out, to find comfort in the one person who hadn't yet walked away. But as she stared at the message, something shifted in her. She had spent so much time looking for someone to fill the void, to heal the broken parts of her. But Clara knew now that she couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep leaning on others to fix what was broken within herself. She didn't respond to Daniel. Instead, she deleted the message. It wasn't about pushing people away. It was about understanding that she had to do this alone. She had to rebuild herself from the ground up without the crutch of someone else. The days that followed were filled with moments of reflection and pain, but also moments of clarity. Clara began to see the path forward, not as a straight line, but as a series of steps. Some were small, some were painful, but each step was a step toward healing, toward forgiveness, toward becoming the woman she needed to be. Mark's absence still stung. There were times when Clara would catch herself thinking about him, wondering if he was doing better, if he was healing too. But she couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The final goodbye had been necessary, not just for him but for her. She couldn't keep holding on to a relationship that had been built on lies, and in some strange way, Clara was grateful for that painful ending, because it forced her to look inward, to face the parts of herself she had been running from for so long. As the weeks passed, Clara started to find peace in the small things: a walk through the park, a quiet evening with a book, a meal she cooked for herself. She had forgotten how much she had neglected herself in the midst of her marriage, forgotten how to be comfortable in her own skin. But now, slowly, she was rediscovering it, rediscovering her independence, her strength, and her capacity for self-love. Clara had learned a hard lesson. She had learned that love wasn't enough to fix everything. The trust, once broken, couldn't always be repaired. But more importantly, she had learned that true healing started from within. It started with accepting herself, flaws and all. It started with taking responsibility for her actions and choosing to move forward with integrity and self-compassion. The aftermath wasn't easy. It was messy, painful, and filled with moments of doubt. But Clara knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the woman who had made those destructive choices. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who knew that redemption was a long road, but one worth walking. And though the past would always be a part of her, it no longer defined her. Clara woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the sunlight filtering through the blinds in soft golden streams. It was an ordinary morning, one she had experienced countless times before, but today it felt different. Today she didn't feel the weight of her past pressing down on her. She felt free. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt like she could breathe again. She sat up in bed, looking around her apartment, the space she had fought to make her own. It wasn't much, just a small, cozy place, but it was hers, and that was something she had come to appreciate more than ever. It was a reflection of her new beginning, of the quiet strength she had been building over the past few months. No longer was she defined by the mistakes she had made or the broken relationship she had left behind. Now, she was defining herself, and it felt empowering. Clara got out of bed and walked to the small window by her kitchen. She gazed out at the city skyline, the world stretching out before her, full of possibility. She had learned so much about herself in the past months, about her resilience, her capacity for change, and most importantly, her ability to move on. The scars of her past were still there, faint reminders of the chaos and heartbreak she had endured, but they didn't consume her anymore. They no longer controlled her every thought, every decision. Clara had taken responsibility for her actions, faced the consequences, and now she was ready to build something new. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from her therapist, a reminder of their next session. It was a small thing, but it was a sign of the progress she had made. Clara had started taking therapy seriously, not just as a way to pass time, but as a tool for real healing. It had been uncomfortable at first, but it was helping her understand the deeper parts of herself, the parts she had ignored for so long. She smiled to herself as she put her phone down. Life was different now. She was different now. She was no longer waiting for someone else to fill the void, to validate her worth. She had learned that validation had to come from within, that happiness had to be something she created for herself, not something she searched for in someone else's eyes. Clara had become her own source of strength. The day ahead was full of possibility. She had an appointment at the shelter she volunteered at. a place that had become an important part of her life, giving back, helping others. It felt like the right way to honor her past mistakes. Helping people who were struggling, who had experienced pain like her own, gave her a sense of purpose. It reminded her that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance for growth, for healing, for redemption. As she drove to the shelter, Clara thought about everything she had learned, how she had learned to forgive herself, how she had learned to stop running from her past. The woman who had walked into that therapy office all those months ago, the woman who had been consumed by guilt, regret, and self-loathing, was not the same woman who was driving now. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had made peace with herself. The shelter was busy when Clara arrived, filled with volunteers and people in need of help. It was the same scene she had seen many times before, but today, it felt different. It felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The work was fulfilling, and the people were inspiring. It wasn't the same as rebuilding her marriage, but it was a form of rebuilding, of creating something positive out of the mess that had been left behind. As Clara worked, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She was doing the right thing, both for herself and for others. There was still so much to be done, so much healing to continue, but she knew she was on the right path. The weeks passed, and with each day, Clara found more pieces of herself. She reconnected with old friends, shared laughs, and allowed herself to enjoy life again. It was still hard at times. There were moments when the memories of her past would come rushing back, the guilt, the hurt, but they didn't hold the same power over her anymore. They were just memories, and she had learned to accept them, to allow them to be a part of her without letting them define her. One evening, as Clara walked home from the shelter, she passed a cafe that she had once frequented with Mark. It was a place they had gone to talk, to laugh, to dream together. She stopped in front of the window, looking inside. It wasn't the same place anymore. The memories were still there, tucked away in the corners of her mind, but they no longer had the sting they once did. She smiled to herself and kept walking, no longer haunted by what had been. The past was gone, and now she was living in the present, in the life she was creating for herself, a life that was hers and hers alone. As Clara continued her walk home, she realized that her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. There would be challenges, of course. There would be days of doubt and moments of weakness. But Clara knew now that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. She had learned how to rebuild, how to forgive, and most importantly, how to love herself. And with that knowledge, she was ready for whatever came next.